Good evening. My name is Anush Terjanyan, and I have the privilege of directing the Anxieties of Democracy program at the Social Science Research Council. It's a privilege to welcome all of you here tonight. I do have a disappointing role to play, and that is to announce that Professor Taylor has come down with a severe cold. He is on the mend, but we didn't feel it was prudent for him to join us tonight. On the other hand, I do have the delicious role of welcoming the three extraordinary women whom we had originally designed to have conversation with Professor Taylor to the podium. So please join me in welcoming Keesha Gaskins, Sarah Leonard, and Tova Wang. We're very interested and have been left with this extraordinary performance by Benjamin Hochman's orchestra, which, as you saw from the program, was intended to leave us with a contemplative moment to think about what happens when a space has been emptied and the democratic space has been emptied, and that is what yields our main subject matter tonight. And I wanted to begin, even though Professor Taylor was unable to make it, he did send along some words, his preliminary thoughts about the subject matter. And so before we launch into our discussion, which we're really hoping will be a discussion that involves you, the public, and includes you as much as possible, I wanted to begin by reading these words of Professor Taylor's about his views on democracy and exclusion. And if you've been following some of our Democracy in the City events so far, you'll see that these are some of the themes that Professor Taylor has been raising from different vantage points. But he begins by saying that modern democracy, as we know it, unlike ancient democracy, is universalist, which means that citizens' rights are meant to apply to the whole population without exclusion on grounds of gender, property, origin, race, and so forth. But in a paradoxical way, democracy can also generate exclusion, and it regularly does. And this means that our really existing democracies have to be continually vigilant and ready to combat this thrust towards exclusion whenever it arises in democracies. So how does this tendency towards exclusion come about? It comes from, according to Taylor, another feature of democracies, both ancient and modern. As free societies, they need some strong sense among the citizenry of being bonded together, of sharing a strong common allegiance. And they need this in order to motivate citizens to do their duty, to pay their taxes, to serve in the armed forces, to come to each other's aid, and without a strong coercive force from above. So there is no mutual trust when we deliberate. When we discuss the common good, are we all talking about the whole or only some part? And there is insufficient mutual help in trouble. But this common allegiance needs a definition, and it needs a sense of what we are committed to. And in modern democracies, this usually has two aspects, according to Taylor. One facet is constituted by a political moral principle, typically human rights, equality, non-discrimination, democratic forms of rule. But there is inevitably another facet, because we are not only espousing these principles in general, but are committed to our particular historical project of realizing them. So our patriotism is directed towards the American Republic, or the French Republic, or the United Kingdom, and so on. And these historic projects are specific to each democracy and are colored by certain crucial founding events, such as the American Revolution or the French Revolutions, but also frequently by other features of our history, of our language, of our ethnicity, and the like. So let's call this two-faceted definition of our pole of allegiance, our political identity, says Taylor. So how can democracies generate exclusion? Paradoxically and tragically, through the force of their political identities. These can turn toxic when they are used to read certain people out of the identity, and therefore brand them as not properly citizens or not worthy of citizenship. And in this way, democratic sentiment begins to work against democracy. So, leaving you with these words of Taylor's, I now give the mic over to, in the capable hands of Keesha Gaskins, who will carry on and lead us through this second act. Thank you so much, Keesha.
Thank you, Anush. Good evening, everyone. All right, that was horrible. So we're going to try this one more time. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
All right, now we can start. We know everyone's here and engaged. Thank you all so much for coming. This exercise, this conversation, as we think about democratic exclusion and what that means for our democracy, for our culture, right now is incredibly important, and we're at an incredibly important time. And I think that all of the conversation, the piece that sort of left us with the performance as full and inclusive performance and the fullness of the music, and then as it becomes sort of awkward as we watch the musicians sort of get up and walk away, and the conductor looks confused, and we're a little confused. And so what does that leave us with? What is it? Is it still the music is still there, but is it still the fullness of the performance? Is it still everything we want it to be? And so speaking of that and speaking of those ideas is what we hope to talk about today, is what does it mean when the fullness of our democracy isn't realized through formal systems of exclusion, as Anush talked about, as we talk about things like formalized citizenship, right? But then we also have operations of our democracy, the tools and mechanisms of our free and fair elections, the opportunities for free speech, the opportunities to engage through the media, and all these other spaces are all very much a part of the democracy, and where we move in and out of those spaces, both formally and informally, how we are defined as part of national identity is very much a part of that democratic exclusion. Oh, I'm sorry. I work with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I am the director of the Democratic Practice Program for the United States. And so that means that I take my history and experience working with democracy in organizing through legal representation. As I like to say, I was an organizer by birth, an attorney by training, and a funder by accident. And taking all of that and working with organizations around the country to try and figure out what are the best points of intervention to really improve our democracy nationally. And I am thrilled to be joined on the stage today. And I will not go into their lengthy bios, but you do have access to them. But to my immediate left is Tova Wang. Tova is Senior Democracy Fellow at Demos and formerly the Director of Democracy Programs at CWA, the Communication Workers of America. Tova has written a really important book, The Politics of Voter Suppression, Defending and Expanding Americans' Rights to Vote. And that work really does, I think, embody a lot of her conversation. So we're excited to hear her talk about the work of inclusion through our formal mechanisms and looking a lot at our electoral processes. And then to my far left, of course, is Sarah Leonard. Sarah's senior editor at The Nation, editor-at-large at the Political Quarterly Dissent. And Sarah has co-edited two also amazingly important books, Occupy, an Occupy Wall Street-inspired Gazette, and The Future We Want, Radical Solutions for the 21st Century, which I'm halfway through, and encourage everyone to get a hold of. It's really an amazing piece. And Sarah's work focuses on feminism, work, technology, and the exclusion that comes from economic inequality. So everything that we're working with today is in three parts, right? So we have our program that is in three parts, and our discussion is going to be in three parts. And so we'd like to start by taking some time to talk about what is democratic exclusion, what do we mean by that? The second part, really talking about what is the implications of democratic exclusion and our current democracy in the moment in time we're in the United States. And then finally turning to looking at potential solutions for some of the challenges that we face today. And then we'll welcome Anoush back up to introduce the final piece, and then we'll be done. And so I apologize in advance. As an attorney, I tell you what we're going to say, we say it, and then I tell you what we already said. I can't break my habit, and I probably won't start now. I'm going to offer some time now. I'm going to turn it over to Tova and then to Sarah to speak very briefly from their lens about what democratic exclusion means from their experience and their work and scholarship.
Thank you, Keesha, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the issue of exclusion, which has become an extraordinarily important topic in this day with the election that's going on. But I'm going to talk about it from my perspective as someone who's worked on voting rights and the issue of voter suppression for the last 16 years since the 2000 election. Voting is not the only act of participation in a democracy, but I believe it's an absolutely essential one. Elections around the world have demonstrated that elections are not in themselves a silver bullet towards having a democratic and fully flourishing democracy. And political movements of the past in this country and around the world, and the powerful movements that are taking place today, are also other ways of expressing one's opinions and participating politically. But at the same time, without voting, meaningful voting, democracy can't stand. The piece of the crisis of democracy we confront now that is, for my work, just crushing is the continuous attack on voting rights of certain communities, now compounded by a political system that is so dominated by wealthy elites and corporations that people kind of feel, well, why should I bother to vote? It really isn't going to make a difference anyway, given that our system has just been completely taken over. And I've reached a point in my work where I have actually a hard time dissuading people of that notion in some ways, but of course, that's my job. So there has been voter suppression throughout our country's history, obviously, but in the last 6 years, it's really been pretty extraordinary. You've heard, I'm sure, and read a lot about it, the voter identification laws, voter intimidation that we're all worried about happening this year, but it wouldn't exactly be the first time it happened if it happened. Purging people from voter registration lists, cutting back on early voting, making voter registration even more difficult than it is already, and it's, by the way, much more difficult in this country than it is in most other Western democracies in the first place. And I would actually argue and really want to emphasize that I think the worst law of all is the one that disenfranchises 6 million people in this country, and that those are the laws that take voting rights away from people who have been convicted of a crime. I think that this is not only wrong in terms of living in a society where we're trying to grow as a civic community, but I also find it to be, frankly, morally and ethically wrong, and happy to talk more about all of that. But elections are supposed to express the will of all of the people, and voter suppression clearly distorts that. Between the laws that block predominantly poor people and people of color from voting, the environment in which people are literally giving up on the process because they think it's so dominated by big money. People who are whiter, who are wealthier, who are older are the ones voting. And frankly, whiter, wealthier, older people don't necessarily have the same values, the same experiences, or the policy preferences as the rest of the population. And in fact, there is a lot of research out there now showing how different the policy choices are of wealthy people as opposed to everybody else on almost every single issue that you might care about. And I'll be honest, we've been in an environment since the election of Barack Obama in which the passing of laws and implementing procedures to block the voting rights of his constituencies, African Americans, Latinos, and young people primarily, has become basically a normal part of the conservative campaign strategy. Trump's most recent rantings about all of this were only made possible by the politicians who ran using voter exclusion as a tactic for winning elections all these years before him. Now, in my book that Keesha was very kind to mention, I talk about what I call the voter inclusion principle. And in its most basic form, it says that election-related laws and procedures should be reformed solely for the purpose of increasing participation, even if that increase is only for one side. As long as it does not suppress anybody's vote, it increases one, that's legit. But the only case in which a law should not do so, even if it does increase participation, is if there's some very strong countervailing reason that is backed up by data and facts and not mythology, like there's voter fraud throughout the system. That would be the only reason not to go for it. But I want to point out finally that the act of voting is not only the pursuit of electing a particular candidate, A welcoming, accessible voting process says something about who we are as a people, our political identity, if you will. Voting is an expression of participation and membership in the democratic system and American society. It is virtually the only thing we all do as a community, except maybe we all watch the Super Bowl. And the act of voting can have an impact on the individual as well that goes well beyond watching the Super Bowl together or the Academy Awards or something like that. When you go into that voting booth or fill out the ballot now at home and mail it in, there's a sense of empowerment, I think, for a lot of people, even if it's not rational, even if it's not close enough that your one vote necessarily in that particular instance is the one that's going to decide it. It's a way of having those names in front of you and making a choice that is recorded and heard. It's a way of saying, I count in this country. And without that, democracy and our society can't survive. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Tova. Sarah?
Thank you for having us here. And I'll just speak very briefly, and I hope we can have a wider conversation. So we are in a sort of interesting period right now where there is a lot of need in this country. I would say since the recession, we have not fully recovered. Many people's jobs have not recovered. If they got jobs back, their wages have not recovered. We're still in sort of a hangover from the latest economic crisis. At the same time, young people who have done what they were told to do and gone to college, preparing to get a job, they're in a huge amount of debt and may not be able to get that job. So people's idea of what the American dream is made of is a little bit in shambles right now. Further, we have a series of social problems. We have a serious opioid epidemic. We have a serious problem with over-policing and police killing young Black people, which our government seems unable to address in any obvious way that makes sense. At the other end, the governmental end, which is meant to be sort of addressing large-scale social problems, we have tremendous deadlock. So almost nothing makes it through Congress anymore. This is not news to anybody. At the same time, we've seen studies like the one that came out of Princeton showing that while wealthy people and organizations that represent business have a serious impact on policy outcomes coming out of Congress, the independent influence of non-wealthy people and their institutions like labor unions have a negligible impact. Now, that doesn't mean that people like you and me never get what we want. We only get what we want policy-wise when what we want aligns with what rich people want. So if we're looking at democratic exclusion, this would seem to be it, right? And this is not, in this case, on the basis of identity. It's more on the basis of economics. And the combination of that sort of oligarchic turn alongside the simple deadlock of Congress on many points has produced this extremely combustible situation where we have a lot of need, no ability to address it. And in a sense, the majority of people feel actually democratically excluded, right? So this has produced a couple of things. One is a set of social movements. We saw Occupy coming up, and you saw a lot of criticism of Occupy along the lines of, why aren't they putting forward policy preferences? Why aren't they writing white papers or hanging out in a park? Don't they know how politics works? Well, you're sort of looking at democratic exclusion right there. These are people who knew that they didn't have access to those levers of power and, in fact, gained power in sort of the media by refusing to play that particular game. After that, we saw the rise of the movement for Black Lives, which I think today is certainly the most vital and important social movement on the ground, which has been combating this absolute epidemic and ongoing epidemic, it's just a thing we're talking about now, of police violence. And connecting that police violence to impoverishment of Black communities through actual policy and decisions that are made politically. The other route, you might say, that's being taken is through the electoral process. And we're certainly looking at one of the most surprising elections in a long time. I remember a couple of years ago, Bernie Sanders actually came to our offices at The Nation, and we're very fond of Bernie Sanders since before the election. We were into him before he was cool. And, he was a senator from Vermont who did not have any sort of national platform, and he was traveling around the country talking with people and holding town halls and trying to figure out if he should run. And he was like, I think I'm gonna run. I'm still sort of figuring it out. What do you guys think? We're like, yeah, great, we love you. I'm sure it'll be great, go for it. We did not think, yes, this will be a massive challenge within the Democratic Party to the Clinton flank of the party. That was not something we anticipated. I don't think it was something anyone anticipated, except maybe him. And you saw a real push to move the Democratic Party from people who felt like they had been kept out of it, that they were not represented inside of it, that Wall Street actually had better representation inside the party than they did. And you saw this sort of coming to a head at the convention where people were extremely upset, right? And this is because, you look at something like Occupy and people say, well, why don't you go vote? But then people do go vote and they still feel like they're on the outside. What do you want us to do? And this is not just specific to America, of course. You're seeing this in the UK with Corbyn and in the rise of all sorts of left-wing parties across Europe. You're also, of course, seeing it on the right. And I don't want to create a false equivalence, but this sense of exclusion, of being kept out of the decision-making process, is certainly alive and well in the minds of people who are voting for Trump because they feel like he's going to shake up the establishment. He has shaken up the establishment, and if elected, he would proceed to exclude whole new sectors of society. But you can see how this response to a feeling of exclusion is not based on fantasy. This is real. And so this is something I think we're all going to have to confront in the time moving forward in the hopes that this can be, someone wants to join us, that this can be a motivation to sort of get our act together and think about how we're going to create more democratic inclusion rather than this sort of horrible fear that's been driving a great deal of the electoral process this time around.
Thank you for those comments. So Professor Taylor's absence has created, I think, a real opportunity and examples of inclusion. So we are going to be fully engaging the audience and hopefully having some dialogue. I've got a few questions in my pocket, but I think what the most important thing to do is really find out how you all are thinking about this. Are there any questions or comments around the first threshold question, which is like, what do we think about what is democratic exclusion when we talk about this? So one here, and then Heath, I see you, sir. Please stand up, tell us who you are, and there's a mic coming to you.
Hello. Hi. My name's Kevin. I'm a law student here in the city. Thank you all for being here. I was curious if you all could speak about representation and around redistricting and gerrymandering, especially you see large swaths of communities of color in the South, like North Carolina and Texas, that are wholesale ignored and written off. So I was wondering if you could talk about that in context to the political system.
Certainly. Do you all have?
I think that's a Tova question.
I think that's a Keesha question.
So, redistricting. I'm sure everyone is aware redistricting is a process by which we define district lines for purposes of legislative apportionment following the census. And so these lines are drawn in very, very different ways, but the vast majority of district lines are drawn by legislatures, by elected officials who draw the lines by which they are then subsequently elected. And so we have legislative lines and districts, and if we just limit the conversation to Congress, we can see that these lines have been drawn in ways to benefit, for the most part, the parties drawing the lines, and as a consequence, undermine the ability of the electorate to actually have their voice be heard and have their voice be known because of the way these lines are drawn. And the implications are fairly clear. When we have folks packed into a district, oftentimes the alignment is designated by party, which then tend to fall back along race. And so we see a lot of racial communities creating majority districts, supermajority districts, and the aspects of representation are completely then undermined by the way the lines are manipulated around people and organizations. So if I give an example, one of the things that we always say is, okay, we're gonna get out, we're gonna engage people, we're gonna turn out voters, right? And so we're gonna go and we're gonna look at these communities of interest, and we're gonna look at poor communities of color in urban areas. So we're gonna take and we're gonna increase the turnout, and we're really gonna change how you're able to influence Congress. You're gonna influence the legislative body. But if in fact, they're drawn into the same districts, as a practical matter, you're not influencing any more seats. You're not influencing a greater body. It has no proportionality to your representation amongst the people. So if I turn out at 50%, my candidate wins. If I turn out at 80%, my candidate wins. How many candidates am I then sending to the representative body? One, and it remains one. And it remains this disproportionality regardless of turnout, and these lines are drawn and then repeatedly drawn by elected officials. When you go back and have to change them, you have to ask these same elected officials to change those lines. And much like money and politics questions, it ends up being a system where you're basically asking people to shoot the horse they rode into power on. And so we look for other opportunities. We look for engagement around independent redistricting commissions. We look for opportunities for multi-member districts, which we haven't seen for a very long time, but arguably could give us the best mode of representation that we've seen. Certainly, we've seen lawsuits under the Voting Rights Act to respond to some of these questions. And in like Port Chester, New York, we've even seen cumulative voting imposed as a judicial solution to redistricting. But the fact is, district lines and the way they're drawn, because they're done in such a partisan way, absolutely limit the level of representation and limit the efficacy of voter engagement activities. Heath, I think we have one here. Can we get a mic over here, please? Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize we had one up here already.
Delivered over here. I'm not sure that it's on. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So my name is Mia. I'm a graduate student in political theory at Yale, and I was here with the Charles Taylor seminar for the past couple of days. And I wanted to pick up on a thread or maybe your conversation that I think relates to part of Professor Taylor's thoughts that he shared with us about problems of democratic inclusion. Specifically, I would be curious to hear Tova and Sarah maybe talk a little bit about whether there's a trade-off between these kinds of perhaps more targeted movements like Occupy or Black Lives Matter that are responding to a reality of democratic exclusion and voter mobilization through elections. One of Professor Taylor's points to us was that was an observation about a recent movement from one model of citizen efficacy that's represented by participation in party politics and voting. And he some concern about the way in which less and less participation.
Yeah.
Sorry, what is that second model exactly?
Yeah, so I
Of
think,
movements.
I don't know that he
But-
had, so he's talking about perhaps that citizens mobilize around, whether that's like an environmental issue or another kind of, but I think he also, there was some discussion of Occupy or of movements that perhaps don't work through the established system or channels of participation.
So kind of thinking
yeah.
about direct action as a theory
Yeah.
and model of change versus
Right.
electoral strategy to affect moving issues.
Right, and do I guess you guys see, or Tova, do you see some kind of trade-off or some sort of a mutual, a kind of a way in which those are I guess the relationship between those two models of citizen efficacy?
Right. Yeah, no, I actually think that's the perfect question for the three of us to talk about a little little bit, because just very frankly, there is a huge tension, I think, in the voting rights community right now about this, because you have a movement like Black Lives Matter, which everyone is incredibly supportive of, and I think is the work that they've done to change the terms of the debate in this country around a number of issues has been incredible. A lot of those same people are describing voting and participating in more traditional forms of politics as sort of going with the establishment and being part of the establishment, and that they're not going to vote because they don't believe in any of the institutions and they don't trust the institutions. And that's sort of a widespread phenomenon right now, is a complete lack of trust in institutions. And for someone like me, I've got, it's like, maybe it's the age I am now, but I keep struggling with how do you convey the idea that it's not either or, it's got to be, because you need to keep fighting from the outside, and the movements have been incredibly powerful. The things that the candidates have talked about during this election are completely different than they would have been if Black Lives hadn't come up, right? So that's been incredibly effective, but if without voting, I mean, you can't sustain it. And so I think you have to come at the problems that are incredible in this country right now from all sides, and express your opinions and make yourself heard in with all the different tools that we have. But that voting has got to be one of them, and how you reconcile that in a time and in a place where it's very easy to understand why people don't have faith in institutions and so-called leaders. So I think that that's a major challenge right now.
Yeah, I guess I would say I don't know a single currently existing social movement that doesn't have a voting component. Like, some people choose not to vote. Some people who are not in social movements choose not to vote. Some libertarians choose not to vote. But there is no, sort of broad social movement that does not include, I would say, a vast majority of people who are planning to vote. And so I think drawing a sharp distinction doesn't really make any sense, and I think is often drawn when people are not, in fact, involved or intimately familiar with the actually existing social movements. I think, if you look at Occupy, for example, there are now Occupy candidates who were involved and are now running for office, and people vote for. There are other people who have gone to work on tenants' rights, and I think that's just as, if not more valid, depending on where you see pressure being able to be put right now effectively. And if you look at the movement for Black Lives, it just really depends what you're looking at. BYP 100 in Chicago, I think, has by far the most sophisticated strategy politically. It's a very politically effective and sophisticated group with a great deal of training, deep roots in Chicago, and they're expanding. But if you look at the work that they're doing, it's there is sort of campaigning and raising awareness around policing, which is tied to policies for them. But they also work to get rid of Anita Alvarez, which was an electoral campaign, who was the prosecutor in Chicago, she was corrupt, she was incredibly punitive, and just really terrible for the people of Chicago. They also work with labor unions. They're allies with the Chicago Teachers Union. So I think that a lot of these movements, which from afar can look homogenous, are actually very internally diverse with a pretty wide range of strategies and a set of pretty smart goals. It's an interesting question because obviously no advocacy group is going to include everybody. If it did, it would be a sign that we no longer had a problem because there was no opponent. So, these groups are going to be narrower than the populace. I think, if you look at it from the perspective of being on the left, then you begin to think in an active way about building bridges between the different movements. So, for example, I'm in a labor union because I work at The Nation and we are unionized. One of the things people in my union have done is turn out as a group for the movement for Black Lives and go down and be like, what can our union do? And you draw those links together and you think about how they can work together and you try to make sure that there are not gaps between movements that are unhelpful, that are causing unnecessary friction, that are making us weaker than we need to be. But I tend to get my hackles up a tiny bit when I feel like people are criticizing movements for being identitarian. I mean, it is possible to be so focused on your own problem that you don't see anything else, but I don't think that's the case with these movements. The movement for Black Lives is a movement specifically for Black lives because Black lives are targeted. And I think it would, and when people respond to that by saying all lives matter, as those of us who spend time on Twitter see often, it's hard not to see that as an attempt to sap that movement's power, which is drawn from an actually existing very specific oppression. So I guess I would say that I believe very strongly in building the bridges between these different movements. I am not concerned that these movements do not, as of yet, encompass everybody, are not immediately welcoming to everybody. There is political opposition.
If I may, I know the question wasn't directed to me, but I think one of the challenges as we think about this, I think Sarah's pointed out some really important things. One of the issues around Chicago prior to the Anita Alvarez vote, BYP 100 and others were working with Chicago Votes to get same-day registration, which then they were able to leverage to be able to use to remove Alvarez, and because 20,000 voters were mobilized through that process to remove Alvarez around folks who were involved with movement for Black Lives. It was clearly an electoral strategy that worked across lines, that worked with white youth and senior and other folks around democratic infrastructure to move an agenda that was tied to a movement. Or I spent, I think last weekend, through an organization called Black and Engage, which works with folks with movement for Black Lives, works with Black Lives Matter, worked with all these, and Black and Engage was targeted specifically to Black youth involved in the movement who want to move an electoral agenda. And it really was designed to target the folks within the movement that weren't saying we're walking away, but working very specifically to say, how are we engaging these folks? How are we leveraging unions? How are we leveraging these engagements? So I think one of the challenges is really looking at the movements as really multifaceted and multi-targeted spaces that really do encompass all the way across the board, because I have to agree with Sarah's comments. I don't think there are any designated movements that don't include some aspects of electoral strategy, fundamentally, because these are sophisticated groups with sophisticated actors who do understand how to move an agenda. I'm sorry, so we have Heath. I remember you had been sitting there. We'll go here one. So 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thank you. Heath Brown from the City University of New York. And I couldn't agree more, and I think one of the perfect examples is the Dreamers movement, who almost by definition don't themselves have voting rights, but have used an electoral strategy of mobilization to complement that. But that wasn't my question. And I have an somewhat abstract question about exclusion, which is, when I think about this, exclusion can be an input or an output. And I wonder if you can sort of respond a little bit to the idea that political exclusion can be an input to other outcomes, or it can be the outcome. It can be the goal, or it can be the means to a goal. Is there one of those two that you might worry about more, or are they inseparable in a way that they don't really exist separate from each other?
Can I?
Please.
I mean, I guess it would probably help to know if you have a specific concern, but I think what you're talking about power. Like, yes, people are democratically excluded so that the people who are excluding them can have their preference hold sway. I mean, that can obviously be an input or an output, but democratic exclusion begets more democratic exclusion, right? It's a narrowing of who holds power, and that will always be a chicken and the egg sort of question. I mean, is there a specific sort of comparison that you would raise?
No, that's why I described it as abstract. I think it's
But I don't know if those are actually different things, I guess is what I'm saying.
One more. Did you want to chime in on that?
No, I was gonna pull a Trump and bring it back to a different subject.
You know what?
No, I think it is worth, if not now, at some point, returning to this question of movements working in tandem with an electoral strategy versus not. Because I don't disagree with any of the incredibly successful things that have happened with these movements, and can't speak highly enough of what's going on there. I do think that there is a problem here that we have for decades now, and it's not getting any better despite what blips may have happened at the margins lately in terms of voter turnout in this country, which is horrendous. I think people have less faith in democracy as an institution than they ever have before, or certainly in many, many years, and have completely disengaged. And I talked earlier about felon disenfranchisement. I mean, one of my things that I really am interested in researching and has been researched a little bit is that you end up creating communities of people who do not self-identify as the type of person who participates. They do not self-identify as a voter. And I think that there is a huge swath of our country that feels that way, that is that turned off and that tuned out and just part of the millions of people who are just off the grid. And some of it is understandable, and some of it is due to structural reasons, and some of it is because of the vote suppression and the money and politics problems. But I think that while there have been great successes of the movements that have to keep going, we still have this problem of people who don't see voting as a viable alternative to effectuating change. And what do we do about that? Sorry.
You're going to be our bird of sunshine. I can feel it now, Tova.
I always am.
From an anesthetic background. So I know two things about this system. This system, number one, keeps all modes of exploitation present in a synchronic way, starting from slavery among illegal immigrants and non-status to different modes of exploitation among the poor, among the marginalized groups, like Black, Eastern, wherever. So it is very, very strong in my mind that it is based on that. That is part of the structure. Can we negate that, negate exclusion in general, without negating the structure? This is the root, this is the essential question. All those. Second thing, the ways that we reflect different types of exclusion in our minds as an ideology, it represents also sometimes a problem for me, because it takes the answer away from the root of the problem. As an example, the identity politics. This idea that we are different because we are different. Not because a system that creates these differences, and we could cross these differences through economic justice, for example, and share same values. I see opinions that glorify or defend injustice in other cultures because they are different. Because they cannot match us, they cannot be like us, they cannot adopt our values. So this is another way that we move away from the issue of the exclusion. In my mind, there is no possible inclusion for real if there is a state, if there is market, if there is professional oppression institution like police and the army, if there is borders. This is the main questions that need to be answered, especially in a time of decline capitalism like what we see right now. Thank you.
I think that's you.
I think that's you. How are we integrating these questions of formal or informal exclusion in our political process, and the relationship between how our entire economy is structured and where people have been just excluded from participating?
Yeah. I mean, many books have been written on this topic. I will do my best. But as a leftist, I also am not thrilled for the prospects of democracy under capitalism in the long term. That said, we are not imminently about to emerge into utopia. And I think one of the things that's very important to me is I think there is a history on the left of privileging, escaping, the capitalist, state-based system before we can eradicate any other oppression. And while I'm sympathetic to that position, what that's created in our movements is a very unhealthy dynamic within which we do not address things like sexism or racism until we emerge on the other side of the destruction of our economic system, which is like a completely implausible way to deal with anything. And the result of that is typically that women, minorities, people who are not privileged within our movements are not as able to make decisions about where those movements are headed, and that hurts us in the long run. And that's something I think actually the movement for Black Lives was much better at addressing than Bernie Sanders supporters actually. The movement for Black Lives, interestingly, like early on when I would go to talk to leaders in the movement and I'd like want to interview them and do an article, whatever, the men would always say to me, okay, yeah, but go talk to these like 5 women. I'll give you their email addresses. Go talk to them, not to me. They were conscious of it from the start. They knew that it would sink them if they didn't pay attention to it. I thought that was pretty smart. You did not see that particularly in the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was pretty purely economically focused. Like you noticed early on that he would say when asked about problems of racism, well, more young Black people don't have jobs than young white people. Now that's true, and that's a thing that has to be fixed, and it's a source of many other sort of escalating inequalities. That said, that alone is not what the experience of racism is. The same as, being a woman, sexual harassment is not like the only thing that has to be eradicated. Like, being a woman in this country is horrible, partly because there's no universal child care. To have a child is to put yourself in a horrible position in this country economically. It's insane. So these are multifaceted problems that have to be dealt with throughout, and you can't just, wait until capitalism is over to deal with them. I do think that there has been that people know this, every generation of social movements, it gets sort of like rediscovered that this is so, but I do think there's a lot of thinking about this happening now, and that those concerns are being integrated into the demands that these different movements are making. I hope that will continue to be the case. But I do, and so I guess I'll just wrap up. I think combining these economic concerns, the idea that jobs are fundamental, and that yes, racism and sexism is partly used as a tool to keep people from organizing around their common interests, with the fact that I think these movements are figuring out sophisticated ways to break down those structures of hierarchy internal to the movement so that the movements can actually represent everybody in the end.
I'll come at this from a different angle really quickly, which is, the issue of economic inequality around the world, but in this country as well, is inherent to this conversation, because the way in which the wealthy have got wealthier and corporations have made more and more profits and everybody else is left behind feeds into this sense of not having any political efficacy no matter what you do, I think. And this has just been further entrenched by the system of money and politics in this country. Everyone knows about the Citizens United decision, but that really is only the latest instance of the Supreme Court allowing our politics to be flooded with money from rich people and corporations who are now basically dictating the terms of our economic system. And so, you're in this vicious cycle that is definitely contributing to people's feelings of being excluded from American society and not having a voice. And so that's, a whole nother piece of this that definitely needs to be talked about in the same terms.
And I think one of the things that I think about the most when I think about some of the challenges you've identified relates, there's sort of 2 pieces. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. There's sort of 2 parts of it. There's the whole decoupling of capitalism from our democracy. So the rules of capitalism sort of operate unfettered as opposed to being constrained through our democracy based on those values, right? That this sort of untethering of these two things is extremely problematic. But then we also have the irreducible factor of race. Right, that we have a tendency to try and conflate race and economics, but in fact, although we have an overrepresentation of people of color within poor communities, the fact is you can fix economic problems and still not solve the questions of racism. And so the labels and things that come along, so our economy is built around counting on the ability to be able to divide and subdivide people by the value of their labor, how they're able to sell their labor, right? I don't know that it's a mistake or an accident that most tip workers remain people of color, that tips arose out of post-slavery and not having to pay ex-slaves wages, and that's where tips came from. And keeping that imprimatur over and over and over again, that continuing to use the bodies of Black and brown, particularly women, in service industries and underemployed, unemployed, trafficking, and all these spaces. These are not isolated economic conditions. These are conditions that are inherently tied to the racial status, oftentimes, of the vast majority of the populations that are tied to this economic tether. And so there are, I think, as we talk about the movements and how these things move forward, we do have to understand and recognize that our economy, as well as our democracy, has been dependent upon this type of segregation, this type of exclusion for its essential operation since our country's inception.
And by the way, just got to add one more thing. It's jumping ahead a little bit, but it's also not a coincidence that while we've been seeing these attacks on voting rights and attacks on any kind of regulation of money in politics, that we've also seen an unbelievable attack on labor unions as the single strongest entity for working people and their voices being heard that we have in this country. And so these things are, I tend to treat them all very holistically and as a piece, that these are all ways of draining the voices away of ordinary working people in favor of the elite. And so I'm jumping ahead because one of my solutions was going to be rebuilding the labor movement, so we can talk about that.
Well, and I think, Sarah, in your intro, you talked about Gillen's identifying as a solution the challenges around labor. Do you want to, we can revisit though.
Whatever you want.
Why don't we catch one more question and we'll put a pin in the labor movement. We'll come back. So we had, okay, thank you, I'm sorry. Then we'll.
Okay, go.
Okay, we've got 2 mics.
You'll
have to forgive me.
My name is Robbie McCauley, and I am a artist. For many years, I and many other artists have been working at modes of communicating serious topics or political topics. And the thing that you're touching on in terms of the sophisticated alliances between different movements a question. I'm wondering how important is it in looking at things from a mega perspective, labor unions, larger movements, and so forth. How important do you see relationships between people psychologically and their ability to talk to each other in long-term ways, long-term processes, in order to change people from the gut level instead of from, the theoretic level. Example, I'm living in Boston now, and a big question on the voting is around charter schools. Should they be held for a moment, for some 6 months, in order to look at charter schools and use that money that was going to develop more? And it's a very, very complicated issue because, of course, all people want better schools for their children. And so my group, which is a political arts group, has a long-term process of meeting with people across cultures and across everything, and finding ways to talk, and finding ways to challenge each other, and finding ways to talk about things that we don't know about each other. And we're just interested in how much of a lack that seems to be. Of mega issues between each other rather than the day-to-day processes that the arts can help do, and that's happening among a lot of artists. And where, finally, where is the news, where is the media in terms of these kinds of efforts that have been going on the ground for so long, these grassroots kinds of movements? And, the media, of course, is mega repeated stuff, but what about these grassroots movements that are so positive in making change on that level?
So if I heard you, you kept it small, right? So how we're thinking about strategies around civic engagement. What about specific opportunities for movements like around deliberative democracy strategies? And what about the relationship between media and how we think about some of the movement work that's going on, and what does it mean to public discourse when media seems to sort of bunny hop over the work that's being done on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Professor Taylor writes about is the need to be able to deliberate together. And the question is, how do we do that at this point? I mean, first of all, I want to just give a big shout out to the work you're doing. I think, obviously, art has tremendous power to bring people together and see things in a new way that is unique and can't be done by people like me who just, talk about stuff or write about stuff. So that's really important. And just, brought to mind the huge amount of research that's developed over the last decade or so, that by far the most effective way to get someone to turn out and vote is to have a conversation with them in person. It takes a lot of work, and that's a lot harder than putting an ad on television, but that's what really moves people. And, I can only imagine that could extend across a number of areas of civic participation. That interpersonal contact is the only way in which someone's self-identity as to who they are and how they fit in with the larger community is going to change. How someone is going to have their self-identity move from someone who just, this isn't their thing, to being someone who's like, yeah, I am a voter. I am someone who gets engaged in this movement. I am someone who supports the arts. And so that's a huge question, I think, for the moment we're in.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would just add that, we are sort of in a period of, Nancy Fraser has called it the crisis of care, where economically everybody has to work quite a lot to support themselves. So it's no longer one wage that will support a family. You need 2 wages. Not every family has 2 wages, but that's what you need to sort of aim for if you're going to take care of yourself. And at the same time, work has become a lot less stable. So we have 11% unionization across the board, and there's, you have people doing irregular shifts and doing tipped work, which is pretty unreliable. And so you have a sort of churn of work all the time. There's not a lot of leisure time. At the same time, there's a sort of this crisis of care, meaning the state is not providing childcare. Private childcare is super expensive. Same with elder care, same with all of the things that actually support a community, make it possible to live. And as a result of this sort of crunch, the idea of leisure time for a lot of working people has become impossible, unimaginable, And so if you think about what it takes to actually be political in the world, the sort of work that you're doing, it takes time, right? And probably a lot of time. And, if people are not able to take the time to do the sort of work you're doing, to walk around their neighborhood, to spend time in the park, to look after kids, to talk to other families, to talk to their family, you're going to have a really big political problem. You have a problem of democracy. It saps the demos. And so I think that is a sort of underreported part of the crisis that we're dealing with. In terms of the media's relation to that, I think the media, that's not really a problem the media can fix, because the media, as you're saying, is very different from person-to-person interaction. I do think that the decline of local media is a huge problem, and very relevant to the points that you're raising. And that is something that we as a society could decide to support. We make choices about this. Those publications can be subsidized. I mean, we could decide as a culture that local media is important to us. Many countries do. So I think in that sense that ties in, and I think, sort of talking about this problem and refocusing on the fact that what people need is not just jobs, but time, is really fundamental to politics moving forward.
Okay, so we have one comment right here in the second row. And I feel like I'm structurally excluding on this side because I don't see this direction. Am I missing anyone back here? Okay, so is that gentleman, we have this young lady, and then we have two over here. So let's start here. We'll move to the back, and we'll come back over here.
Thank you. I was part of the seminar with Professor Taylor as well, and I'm at the anthropology department at the Graduate Center at CUNY. And it's interesting because what he's trying to do very bravely actually is to revive this sort of spirit of the demos or the democracy. And of course, it's not an easy project to do. But it's interesting because what he thinks of this idea of equal citizenship, and Tova, it's I think probably directed towards you, is that he's thinking of sites from which people could think of equal citizenship, and while taking their differences along. And I think that's one of the most hard things, because we think of exclusion when we think of differences. And what you say about voting together, and I was thinking if this is something that could be thought of. As I'm saying, I'm not Professor Taylor, I'm just kind of thinking with him. And is it possible to think of, but in what ways would it be possible actually when we have material differences and democratic exclusion kind of thing? So sitting here was saying as well that it sounds more like economic exclusion. And I wonder if that's what it is at the end. And if that is the case, then how do you move along, and how do you create that sense of sort of civic participation when the differences themselves are so real and so material?
Well, so this does go back to a lot of what Professor Taylor also talks about in terms of, our excluding people who come from the outside, who we see as the other, and then this sort of like internal exclusion of being hostile towards anybody who doesn't seem to be like us. And so, we have the problem, obviously, enormously around the world with, hostility, putting it mildly, towards immigrants. And you also see the internal strife, and, this has gotten better, but, in terms of, LGBTQ rights and so on in the country, hostility towards anyone who is not seen as the same. And one of the theories that I hope I understand Professor Taylor correctly, is moving towards a model of where people's individual liberties is really the thing that holds us together. But then he also questions whether that can work. I guess the ideal would be to move towards a place that I think Americans thought we were at, but we clearly are not right now, which is where we celebrate our differences. And that's one of the things that is our American identity, is the ability to be so diverse and yet thrive. And I think, because of economic dislocation and because of straight up racism and xenophobia, we're losing that. But I still do think that there's probably an underlying current in this country that does see us as being, I don't want to use the word exceptional, but being unique in the sense of anyone who comes here, anyone who lives here who's willing to try really hard and work really hard and do their best, should have an opportunity. I mean, that has sort of been the value that we were supposed to be all coalescing around. And it's whether we still can hang on to that, given what's happening right now, both in terms of socially and economically, and both just in this country and globally.
Yeah, and I guess when you talk about economic exclusion, too, I would just say it would be helpful for Americans to think a little more creatively about the places into which we can extend democracy. I mean, we do think of democracy as being a political thing that happens in town hall or in the voting booth or whatever, but I mean, we spend most of our time at work, frankly, most Americans, we're at work all the time, whether we like it or not. That would be a great place to think about expanding democracy. That's why I'm in a union. We get a say in our office. And that is an idea that I think has fallen by the wayside because the typical educators in that idea were labor unions, and they are on their back foot and they don't represent the majority of American workers. So, at this point. So I do think one way of tackling both the question of economic exclusion and the challenges of getting towards a more democratic society under those conditions is to just expand our idea as to where democracy can go, So that's obviously, we could talk about that forever, and that doesn't solve the problem because we're struggling to get there. But that's one way I would think about it.
And as we think about rebuilding labor, we also have to remember that it didn't just fall by the wayside. There were systematic interventions that actually, not the least of which are right to work laws. And we've now got 2 states, Alabama and Virginia, that are that are on the ballot with right to work moving to the state constitutions. And so those are very, very serious interventions.
And by the way, bankrolled by the same people who brought you Citizens United, and we haven't even brought up Shelby.
No.
I mean, it's the
unions brought you the weekend.
Right.
Compare, contrast. No, but I mean, it literally is the same individuals and groups of people who are pushing and financing and bankrolling the movements to destroy voting rights for certain communities that they don't see as being in alignment with them, being able to control the political system by being able to spend as much money as they want and their corporations can on elections, and by destroying the one real voice for working people, whether it's in the workplace itself or in the public sphere, and that's the unions. And it's not, I'm not trying to be conspiracy theorist about this, it's just, it's understood. That is the way that, these are the ways in which people get heard, and that is threatening.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little moderator's privilege at this point because we are fast approaching time. We're going to take about 2 or 3 questions at once just so we can hear what the questions are, and then we can kind of take some answers together. So let's go with this gentleman right here. And then we have 2 over here. We'll go with the gentleman in the glasses and the person in the back with the beautiful hair.
Hi, thank you. My name is John Radisky. How do you feel this post-fact political discourse plays a role in voter exclusion, and what can be done to combat that?
So, I mean, I have a really,
I'm sorry,
we're
hold
taking
you.
more than
I
one
want to take
time, sorry.
a couple questions.
Hi, my name's Danny. I'm a researcher at Columbia Law School. I have a question for Sarah Leonard, but I'd appreciate responses from all panelists about technology and the way that it's been used to undermine the democratic process. So just 10 days ago, the ACLU reported that Geophedia, a website, was being used by law enforcement agencies to gather data about protesters through publicly available information on Twitter and Facebook. But the issue is, even though geophilia was banned from these social media platforms, the data is still publicly available, so the problem still exists, right? So my question is, what can we do to convince civil society to take seriously the threat from social media and from other technology giants that play such an important role in the democratic process today?
And then the young, I'm sorry, I keep genderizing and I apologize over here.
Hi, I would like to point out, my question reflects to the foundations of democracy. When you look at the history of the American people by Froner, you see that democracy was not established by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but life, liberty, and the availability of property. So from the beginning of, our great country here, democracy was seen as an ideation of economic policy and right, reflected and segregated to a specific people for the use of their own benefit, especially when it came to political approach. What kind of democracy are you guys looking at? What is your definition as to what you guys are speaking of today? Because our foundation doesn't seem to have changed, but worsened in a more sophisticated manner.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions. We've got the post-fact political environment, where we're just sort of debating around with individual ideas of what the truth is. Technology undermining our democracy, as well as, and I would append to this, which is another challenge, these social media platforms being the basis for organizing, yet they are not public spaces and controlled by corporations. What does that mean? When we're so dependent upon these spaces for our engagement, yet they are not in fact themselves democratic spaces. And then we have the very, very small question of what is the vision for democracy in the 21st century, when in fact the infrastructure and the rigging of democracy was never designed to be fully inclusive or fully enfranchising, and how does that evolve, and how do we meaningfully talk about solutions in that context as we're thinking about going forward, which is a perfect time because we are at time to turn to solutions. And so let's take them in whatever order you all choose to do so. But I would also encourage you all to think about, we're going to move into the solution space. So as we respond to these questions, think about what's also next and what we can do about these things. Jump in.
Well, maybe, can I take the social media question first? Sure. Because I think it's very specific. It's a great question. I wish I had a better answer. I teach a course on this too. And one of the challenges is getting undergraduates to care about the fact that their data is being collected. I think it's important that they care about that. They're not so sure. And so I did find one workaround that kind of worked, and I think this may work on adults as well. Which was that they regarded the issue of surveillance fairly impersonally, because by and large, they didn't actually feel someone breathing down their neck. And the usual explanations, I'm not doing anything wrong. And with activists, even, you hear this sometimes, we live in a democracy, they're not gonna arrest me for organizing this protest. And so I said, okay, so you go to NYU, you have a ton of classmates, you know a lot of people, from NYU, probably a lot of kids will go on to work in the tech industry in some form of technology, maybe for the government. And so imagine, look at the kid sitting next to you, think, okay, that kid, say they go on to work at Facebook after graduation. There have been some scandals where in the back end of Facebook, people who work there were just reading people's messages. Reading their personal notes to each other, not the stuff that's on your wall. And I said, okay, so the idea of some stranger doing that, whatever. But imagine the person you have a crush on working at Facebook and reading all your shit, right? And all of a sudden they're kind of and I was like, okay, now the number of people in government who have access to classified information, we now know, is absolutely massive. I mean, thousands and thousands of people. And so, imagine this sort of cute Facebook problem expanded tenfold. And I gave them to read a Washington Post article actually about LoveInt, which stands for Love Intelligence, which is a sort of code name given to cases where people with access to classified surveillance information use those technologies to spy on or stalk people who they are romantically interested in. This is obviously illegal, but it does happen. It has a corollary with the famous episode of John Oliver's show where he was trying to get Edward Snowden to explain the technologies that he had revealed. And John Oliver was like, this is so boring. No one is going to pay attention to this. This is tedious. I don't know what these acronyms stand for. And he was like, OK, we're going to try it a different way. And he hands Edward Snowden a picture of his penis, and he says, this is a dick pic. I'm going to tell you how I messaged this to people. You tell me if the government saw my penis. And this turns out to be a very effective way to get people to understand what is going on, because suddenly people are concerned. And so this is a dick pic test, which has turned out to be actually fairly successful if you're trying to educate civilians in intelligence efforts. And I have found that this works with my students as well. So there are a number of ways of getting people in the door of understanding it's creepy to have someone look at your stuff. And then when it comes to activists, I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done, much of which is being done by good groups like the ACLU and Freedom of the Press Foundation, which has been tremendous. And what they're trying to do is make this stuff less scary. So, if you use Signal for messaging, you're a lot safer than if you use an unencrypted messaging app. It turns out it's not that hard to do, but most people don't know about it because it's not being marketed by a large company that has the ability to educate everybody about it. So that's work that has sort of fallen to us to do. I do think that we are going to have an ongoing problem of trying to have democratic communication within spaces like Facebook and Twitter, which are corporate controlled and therefore designed not to foster good conversation, but simply to keep you on the platform. And there have been a number of suggestions that these companies be nationalized, which is interesting. I'm not sure it would fix the problem, but there are arguments that there should be aggressive interventions to democratize these spaces because they've proven so influential in the ways that we have democratic conversations. I guess that in itself could be a whole much longer conversation, so I'll stop there. But I think people are starting to realize the implications of this, especially as reports come out that law enforcement has been spying specifically on Black Lives Matter. And during Occupy, they arrested people before the protests even started sometimes. So yeah, I think people are actually beginning to understand that.
And just to piggyback on that, if you're actually interested in engaging along these questions, Free Press, freepress.org is on the former, looking at some of the surveillance work and actually taking some action on that. Colorofchange.org is very, very aggressive in working on trying to deal with the corporate questions around Facebook and Twitter. So those are two places to actively get involved or really look at how people are actually trying to engage and respond to these questions. So let's turn to...
I'll take a shot at the other two.
There you go. So you can, while we go with post-fact, and let's end up on the 21st century democracy piece. I think that's a little fleshy. And so maybe if we could get to the, my facts aren't your facts, but that's our politics.
Yeah. So, we're beyond the truthiness to just no truth at all. From what I understand, and people can correct me, from what I have read in the polling and so on, the biggest gap in this election is an education gap as to who you are going to be voting for, which is interesting, right? And it's not nearly as exciting as what you just heard about, but a revisiting of what is the label needs to change, but civic education in the schools really needs to be revisited. It sounds boring, but it really isn't, and it doesn't need to be. And I think that there does need to be a reimagining of what that could be. And to bring it to a very practical level, one of the things I'm a big fan of is pre-registration, which is where you can register kids to vote at 16 and 17, and it becomes activated when they're 18. If you could my imagination is that you could combine doing this pre-registration in high schools with a very practical kind of issues-based, but also practical course and interactive course on democracy and voting, and connect the registering to vote with why it's important and what it means in democracy. I think that I'm kind of it's tempting to just sort of say people over a certain age, like it's kind of a lost battle at this point, but investing in education, obviously, because that's where the gap is, but then more specifically, teaching younger people to think critically about the information that they get in the political context and how to make sense of it to be a good participant in democracy. And I guess we get to this big meta question?
The big meta question, and so that will be our last question. We are coming up on time according to the run of show. So really looking at the question, what does a 21st century inclusive democracy look like, and what are the key structures that we're going to need to have in place to make sure that both our formal policy and our informal ways of engagement can bring us closer to that space?
Do just like a minute each and solve that question?
I'm just going to throw out there something very practical, if that's okay, because it's something that I'm doing a lot of work on, and so I can speak to it, which is I would wish to see our voter registration system brought into the 21st century, if you want to talk about what is our democracy in the 21st century. And I think that means sort of shifting the paradigm more towards what's common in other countries around the world, which is that the government is actually responsible for ensuring that you're registered to vote and you just show up and you vote. And there is a really strong movement in the country right now towards using government databases that already have all the information that they need in order to register someone to vote and automatically putting eligible people onto the voter registration list. And this is happening in a number of states now in a variety of ways, particularly through DMVs, where if you have an interaction with the DMV, you are automatically registered to vote if they can ascertain that you're a citizen, and you are notified of your opportunity to decline to be registered, but the default is that you are registered. And so I think in general, the registration process needs to be flipped on its head, and hopefully we're beginning to go in that direction. And all the groups that have to spend so much time and resources and the foundations that have to put so much money into voter registration drives and so on can really focus on the issues and getting people to care about voting and voter turnout. And it's also just upgrading our system from a technology perspective. There's no reason why we should be filling out these, forms by paper and then like mailing them someplace, and then you have someone like manually entering the data and probably making mistakes, and then you're not on the list when you get there. So really upgrading in terms of technology and also shifting the paradigm of how we think about being, this is part of what we perceive of as encouraging democracy is if people are registered to vote and simply can just vote.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say in broad terms, the reason we were talking about labor unions before is, Piketty had a bestseller recently pointing out that inequality is growing globally, showing very little signs of stopping. And it's really hard to have a democracy under those conditions. We could get back even our rules about money and politics. We could even have better voting laws. And I think that as long as there is really extreme inequality, that power imbalance is going to make it really hard to have a healthy democracy. And so when we look at efforts around revitalizing unions and that sort of thing, I think we're looking at an effort towards democracy too. And so what those specific mechanisms will look like in the long run are super important. And I think we actually know what a lot of them are. And we need to sort of reclaim a lot of that power in order to be able to put them into place in a way that would be meaningful. And I guess that's how I'd answer that.
So as we think about what it means to have a vital, inclusive democracy in the 21st century, a lot of it is going to be talking about economic inequality. We have an economy now that's driven by financialization, right? And not by production, not by people, not by wages. As long as our economy is driven by financial decisions and trading of stocks, the benefits can't flow to people. We have to really meaningfully think about what does it mean to have fair wages? What does it mean to have people employed? What does it mean to have people producing products that people can then purchase and vitalize the economy around people, not around financial products and financial shenanigans, right? As we talk about inclusive democracies, we're talking about infrastructures that meaningfully engage individuals. When we look at things like our Congress, which is just simply outgrown its britches, are we meaningfully talking about engaging technological solutions that really around engagement of places like the constituent engagement services and all these things that actually are around the interface of our democracy? And it's really looking at each level of interface and interchange with our democracy and meaningfully think about issues of structural racism and economic inequality as part of policy development and not an afterthought to how we engage around these issues. Thank you all so much for coming and allowing us to engage in this conversation. And talking about inclusion, I want Anoush to lead us into the next part for the musicians.
Thank you again to our Thank you again to our panelists. Again, a hand of applause. And we are now going to welcome the orchestra again for a more optimistic end to our evening. We ended on a solution-based note, and Jessie Montgomery, who is the composer, is here with us tonight. We're very honored by her presence. And her piece, Starburst, is intended to lift us up so that we can continue the discussion on a more positive note at the reception afterwards.
What an extraordinary way to end this robust evening. I'm Ira Katz-Nelson. I have the privilege of serving as president of the Social Science Research Council. First, it's just wonderful, truly wonderful to have Jesse Montgomery, the composer, here. A word of applause again for the and to these brilliant musicians led by Benjamin Hochman, please. And to Keesha and Sarah and Tova, thank you so much for this vigorous discussion of a kind of intellectual, public, activist, public space that you've given us to consider fundamental issues about American democracy, asking us to think about what is our common sense of where we need to go. And thank you all for coming and for being part of the extended community of the program that Anush leads on Anxieties of Democracy, and now having joined the family of the Social Science Research Council. There's a reception right outside where the conversation can continue. Have a great time.